Empires have risen and fallen, alliances forged, and cities burned. The blood of man and beast runs strong across the continent, where steel and fire paved the way for the emperors and kings of this land. The last great kingdom of Telor was the mannish land of Iridéa. In classical Finori, the common tongue so to speak, the name translates to the White Kingdom, referring to the pristine and order of the kingdom. Beginning as one of many warring nations and baronies after the Servati Empire fell, Iridéa would come to make an alliance with the lords of the Silver Sword Coast. This combined naval and land power would lead to the invasion of Barand. The combined riverine and seafaring ships of the Irideans and the Silver Sword folk would invade upriver and pillage the towns and cities of the Barandian folk. Soon after the event called Baccanial Lake was taken, Barand fell and was assimilated into Iridéa and Silver Sword. Soon the burgeoning kingdom of the Aoran Pact, as it was called, after their shared river, looked west and east. The first king of the new Iridean hegemony, Imbrahil I, came to the horse riders and Tarakir tamers of the Firefront Plain, then called the Radanar Fields. They made a trading alliance where the horse riders of the fields would be promised metalworks and exotic goods from the Iridean trade, and then the riders would fight for the Irideans. They took up the offer. A month later, in the new spring of 506, the combined forces of the Radanar Fields and the Iridean cavalry shattered the lines of the Finori forces of Brassdale. Local militias and mercenaries could not stand to hold the lines against the Iridean armies. The geography of Brassdale, as it was once called, also stood against the Dale folk's advantage. Flat plains and only sparse Mediterranean woodland let the horsemen and soldiers of both the fields and Iridéa gallop and march across the Dale uninhibited. It is here that the remaining peoples of Finor formed an alliance, much like the Aoran Pact of the Silver Sword and the Irideans. This alliance, much like the aforementioned pact, was named after their common river. Therefore, the Namril Pact was set in stone and still binds the culturally united Finori peoples to this day. This pact was formed to combat the invading Western folk. Off-Cooled and Off-Bard, both foreign peoples from the great continent of Helgemar to the east, were the main kingdoms in this pact. These foreign newcomers to Telor practiced the arts of thaumaturgy, the balancing and controlling of vital energies in living things. This practice still survives to this day, though it is much diminished compared to the still rare runic magics. However, this control of life and will which the Off possessed met the Irideans with resistance. They would confound the Iridean soldiers with phantom thoughts or strange premonitions, or break their will and courage, causing them to flee. Although, with each user of thaumaturgy slain, so was the greatest defense of the Off-Cooled and Off-Bottom militaries. Imbrahil, king of Iridéa, was cunning, however, and so he and his army marched into the foothills. There, they made a deal with the local Gilbelow hill folk, who saw the 5,000-strong army of battle-hardened horsemen and decided to wisely side with Imbrahil. There, they agreed to let Imbrahil pass from their foothills and take the Off kingdoms by surprise, attacking their line on the Off-Bard border from behind whilst their remaining 2,000 soldiers distracted them. In exchange, trade would be opened to the Gilbelow. Imbrahil had a habit of opening trade with local peoples to further his plans in alliances. In the summer of 507, the plot was deployed. 6,000 Iridean horsemen, archers, knights, and foot soldiers marched against the Off-Bard war camps from the behind, as they are distracted with the remaining soldiers left behind around the Sea Shadow Plains. You may be wondering what Sea Shadow the other kingdom was doing during all this, and the admittedly boring answer is not much. They let the Iridean armies march out to meet the off armies because they were already dealing with internal corruption and assassination attempts, which were actually being caused by Iridéa and the Silver Sword, more on that later, and had a fairly meagre military. These combined factors would lead to the marching of the armies and the peaceful annexation of Sea Shadow after the off-cooled and off-barred were broken. When the so-named Battle of the Red Hills was fought and the War of Off finished, Iridéa took Fëanor for itself. Imbrahil's armies would spend the next few months travelling across Fëanor, securing alliances and oaths of allegiance the same way the king had done with the Gilbelow and Ralanar horsemen. Now, this is where the histories of modern Teloran folk end, excluding the Silver Sword in the conquests and success of Iridéa. However, they played an equal part in the forging of the last great kingdom of man, while Imbrahil used trade alliances, trickery, and warfare to secure Fëanor. The Silver Sword Queen Dermanfine II used a different strategy. In her service was her half-brother, Udanin, who was a master of spycraft, diplomacy, and statecraft. During the time, all except Dermanfine wondered how Udanin did it, how he kept track of labyrinthian plots and maze-like networks of alliances, spies, and information. Some say he had spies in every city and large town in all the south, although there's no way to prove or disprove that statement. As Imbrahil secured Fëanor, Dermanfine and Udanin set up the River Eorin to be the most loyal of Iridéa's holdings. The spies of the Silver Sword planted ideas and rumours across every town and corner of the river's region as they could. Word of the phantom wealth Imbrahil and Dermanfine had brought in their conquests, of the honour and glory found in service to both kingdoms. This was surprisingly effective, with any outspoken opponents of Iridéa and the aggressive conquering of such shut up for fear of prosecution and denial from their communities. Udanin's spies, who are still known as the Silver Eyes after the Silver Sword Kingdom, to this day as Dorinea's intelligence-gathering network, were sent out to the lands of Bluedale, Black Dagger, Ironbreak, and Woodtoe. The Silver Sword coast already held the port city of Lenilmut at the mouth of the Nalaran River, so not as much military force was required in this new conquest. Spies and diplomats wove the workings of Udanin across the kingdoms. Soon the Black Dagger coast, which was more of a collection of city-states than a unified nation or city, willingly assimilated with the Silver Sword coast and the Silver Eyes' influence. The kingdoms of Bluedale and Ironbreak were recovering from wars with the Cowlkin, and they saw the goals of Silver Sword and Iridéa. They formed the Pact of Taran Vor, named after their shared mythical founding figure as a military alliance against the gathering storm. By 507, Woodtoe was still holding strong against the attempts of Udanin and his agents to make its lord, Bortolin, bow to Dermanfine and Imbrahil once and for all. However, a new force would change the tide of this stalemate. The eagle beast of the ice spires, Zarantulab, had come from its peak homes and was tearing apart villages of Woodtoe and Bluedale. It was awakened from the frostbitten nomads' ritual horns. This antlered avian monster was gigantic, nearly draconic in size, and could hew stone apart with its metallic claws. Woodtoe militias had to pull back, and many trusted military advisors travelled to the frontier to combat the beast. This is when Udanin's spies saw their opportunity and finally brought the last stage of the combined Silver Sword and Iridean conquest to beginning. They assassinated the Lord Bortolin of Woodtoe and thus pushed the kingdom into disarray. This brutal attack was rumoured to be the work of the Silver Sword, which was correct, of course. Many began to regret supporting the Eorin Pact. However, only two nations stood free from the pact. Bluedale and Ironbreak still stood strong for 2 years. However, the armies of Imbrahil were returning from their conquest of Fëanor by 509 SR, after 2 years of conquest and forming a solid and stable control over Fëanor. The Dukes of Bluedale and Ironbreak were no strangers to war. They had battled the demilitaristic Cowlkin and the frost-bitten nomads back over the Icespire Mountains. Not only that, but the forgotten beasts and monsters from said mountains had been continuously defeated by their armies. Now, the War of Shatter Steel had begun. Imbrahil had took command of a mixed Silversword and Iridean armada. He sailed up the River Ironford and pillaged and then fortified all the large towns he could reach. However, the Ironbreak Duchy was not unprepared. At the high city of Arkinreen, Duke Avarast VIII would pile as much rubbish, timber, stone, and oil as he could find. He set the load in a net across the Lewinster Bridge, where he released it downstream. With arrows attached to a flaming kindling tuft, the oil was set alight. Soon, the Imbrahil's armada was met with a wave of filth and liquid fire. Many men died from the heat alone, Imbrahil himself becoming gravely sick from a combination of the filth and pestilence in the river and raw temperatures. He survived, though had a long and exhausting recovery. Courage and will broken, the men of Imbrahil's army fortified and bunkered down in their settlements that they had already taken. As the armada of Imbrahil recovered, his cousin Cataran, who until now was keeping peace at the Aorn River, was approaching Bluedale from the River Nalaran. Quickly, however, he left the river for the woodlands and hills of the Dale, navigating his forces through wilderness and savage lands. After 6 days' travel, so long for his stealth and covertness in journeying, they had reached the Dale's northern frontier. However, word had reached Duke Hegelfed of Bluedale from local rangers and farmers of the north that another army was coming. Spear, shield, bow, and axe and sword were honed and forces mustered. In what was meant to be an ambush by Cataran, it quickly became one of the bloodiest battles of Iridea's founding. 3,000 combined troops of Bluedale and Ironbreak met the line of Cataran's 2,400 men. Arrows flew like rain. The sound of clashing metal was louder than one's own thoughts. Entire squads were wiped out in single charges from both sides. The hills and woods of North Bluedale were soaked in the stench of rot and death months after the conflict. Cataran was slain by a hailstorm of arrows, and this huge bloody mess was titled the Battle of Demise. When word reached Imbrahil a month later, he was furious and immediately commanded all of his troops to pull back from Ironbreak and march on Bluedale. However, his advisors and Dermanfine, who was now visiting, managed to rein in his rage and let Imbrahil think clearly once more. The assault on the Ironbreak would continue, and then Bluedale would follow. The army of Bluedale was significantly culled in the attack, and its duke, Hegelfed, who would be called the Cowardly by historians, fled to the high city of Ironbreak, Arkinreen. In 510, at the yawning of the new decade, of the new spring, came the Sunlords. In their ride of the Sunlords, a vast prairie, now called the Iril Plain, they rode atop horses and Tarakur of all things. Their god and emblem was the sun in the sky, whose golden light reflected on their golden grasslands. Months prior, Udin had made a deal with the Sunlords to come to their aid in exchange for the Iril Plain to forever be theirs, and for no settlers from other peoples to come there. Now, Udinin and Dermanfine called upon that oath, where they spent the next 2 months rallying their horsemen and Tarakur men, and travelled across wood, river, until now they had come. The largest army ever to march across Telor, 8,000 horsemen came through the chaotic and disarrayed Woodtow. From the Nalaran River they crossed its many bridges, they rode out to secure their freedom and respect as a true kingdom of Telor for all ages to come. In the day of sunfall, the Sun Lords and their cavalry crashed down on every Bluedale village, town, tower, and city. For 3 months passing into the summer of 510 SR, they pillaged and robbed the duchy of its riches. The people of Bluedale would willingly join Iridéa and the Silver Sword Coast after being abandoned and betrayed by their cowardly Duke Hegelfed. Word reached Imbrahil that the Sun Lords had come, and the fall of the last opposing kingdom of Iridéa was at hand. After giving a great speech, which actually might just be an exaggeration by Teloran historians, he made landfall and marched across Iron Break at last. 8,000 from the north, 2,000 from the south. The last hammer fell on the war of Shattersteel, where the last kingdom of man was forged in steel and fire. Avarast was cornered in his keep in Arkinrin, and Hegelfed had already been forfeited to the attacking armies by disgruntled soldiers and Dale folk. At last he surrendered to the opposing forces. Ironbreak was annexed in the summer of 511, nearly 1 year after the last opposing monarch of the south had surrendered. The Aorn Pact was fulfilled, and the kingdoms of the Silver Sword Coast and Iridéa merged to found the new kingdom of Iridéa. For the next 5 years, the last of Imbrahil's life, rebellions and outspoken opposers of Iridéa were dealt with, loyalty ceded, and respect for the new kingdom planted. Trade agreements and fringe tribes were assimilated with the Gilbalo, Ralanar, Field folk, Sun Lords, and many other smaller peoples paid in full with trade and exotic goods. In this new age, for man and the south, trade flourished as sea routes and land routes with Odira, Zerial, the Atkaran cities, and Kahal formed. Whilst Iridéa would in the coming years attempt to invade Thrym, however, these proved unsuccessful in the small gap of Wistering, and so the wall of Wisterin was constructed. It was woven from many different smaller stone, clay, and wooden fortifications scattered across the gap. Expeditions to the great wilderness of the Pwyll and the Druid were much more successful, however. Iridéa formed the borderlands, a buffer zone of new towns, keeps, and a handful of small cities. These foreboding, untamed lands would often come into wars and battles with the Pwyll, and sometimes even the peaceful Druid over the Highfall Vale. Great tales of heroes and monster slayers come from this frontier. However, the greatest strength of Iridéa was its alliance with the Dwarves of Teal. The Dwarves of Teal were an industrious culture of dwarves. They made great aqueducts and channeled water from melting ice caps in their mountains down to their holds and fortresses. Huge dams were constructed from the mountain stone, and a deposit of grey steel, also called storm steel, was found deep in their holes from ages past, when lightning struck the rock deep. The Tealian dwarves wore gold and silver, as if were simple wooden accessories, and silks like they were leather and animal furs. They often had pale skin from years underground and dark auburn hair. A distinctive trait of all Tealians and Tealian descendants is their eyes, ranging from deep greens and blues to gold, and being unusually large to see efficiently in the dark. However, Tealian culture and features will be discussed another time. For now, know that they are powerful and wealthy. Whilst the dwarves of Teal had access to nearly all metals and gemstones they could want, and all luxuries, one thing they greatly desired was food. Fine foods, gourmet, lowlander meats, smoked or grilled or fried. Whilst they could provide for their people the collected holds, which acted like a pure polity system of city-states, much like ancient Greece, their diet was fairly bland. Mushrooms had been domesticated and offered some variation, but only a few breeds had been derived. Goat, goat milk, cheese, and scarce meat was available, but not in great quantities. However, Iridéa had all the exotic foods, goods, tools, and crafts the Telian dwarves could desire. At first, only private merchants began trade with Teal, but soon Iridéa itself made many more deals and alliances with the hosts of Teal, of which there were 20, with many homesteads and smaller forts scattered across the mountains. Paved roads from the peaks to the lowlands were built, and keeps and towers were set up to patrol and guard the many paths and passes from Iridéa to Teal. The dwarves exchanged abundant metals for exotic food, cloth, meats, and spices. This trading led to Iridéa not falling within 3 generations, as the Sarvati Empire and previous Varassian Empire had done before. The wealth and resources gathered from Telian trade kept many larger cities, guilds, towns, and peoples happy with the rule of Iridéa. Teal also was much more stable with the increased living standards of its people. With such stability in place, in 578 SR, the many high nobles, basically ministers, of statecraft and information came together to finally put a rest to the confusion around the lay of the land of Iridéa. They declared 3 baronies and 3 royal families of the baronies, who were chosen to be royalty by local rulers around each barony. Praf in the west, Dorinia in the central regions, and Fëanor to the east. The borderlands would come to be a protectorate of Iridéa in later years, not a full barony. Each barony were assigned counties, and I know that in history counts were above barons, whilst in Iridéa that's flipped, barons are above counts. I just don't care, I really like counties. Also, I'm Irish, okay, so counties are kind of a big thing over here. Each was ruled by a count, selected by the ruling baron, and then passed down to that count's descendants. Praf was assigned 5 counties based upon the already existing townships and agreements. Dorinia was given 7, and 1 was renamed the Frontier Flame after it was abandoned in the Worm-Waking and Iridéa fell. Arinthia, at the mouth of the Aorn River, was the new high city or capital of the kingdom. The right of the Sun Lords was legitimized as its own sovereign entity after their service to the Iridean conquests. The Ralanar Fields, in modern times called the Firefront Plain for the soon to come and already aforementioned Worm-Waking, was considered a buffer zone between the opposed loyal peoples of Dorinia and the disgruntled with Iridéa's rule ideas of Fëanor. However, that mentality would change when Fëanor got filthy rich from Iridean trade. Fëanor was allotted 5 counties based on their relation to bodies of water, as riverine and sea trade and travel was so important for Fëanor. Coastal counties shared river systems with inland counties. However, they were less defined by rivers and more to sea than, say, Irnor or Kerelafor. The Wall of Wistern is off this map, however it borders the county of Dor Barald. Whilst some naval colonization was attempted by Iridéa, they were bounded by tropics and the desert to the south, a climate far too warm and humid, not only for Irideans but also for their equipment. Bowstrings would snap like twigs, and their very swords would be too hot for them to hold. Below the county level, Iridéa was ruled by local lords, who ruled a handful of villages, but actually resided in their largest town or even city if they presided over one. In terms of populations, I haven't gotten the best idea, however I have some rough estimates. In general, Tynor has 42,800,000 people. Durnia has 39,700,000, and Prath has 31,400,000. Those numbers are subject to change. Grey Bay and Orinthia are the largest cities in Telor, with vast, sprawling trade networks, guilds, roads, and much more. There were 16 kings of Iridéa, including Imbrahil I, known as the Tarim royal family of Iridéa. Their crown was made of gold and is hard to rust, encrusted with rubies and emeralds obtained with trade from Teal and the desert land of Ziriel. Unlike many real royal families, cough cough, English royal family tree, cough cough, this family tree isn't too tangled and messy. This is due to the kingmakers, another family appointed by Imbrahil who would keep the Tarim in check. The kingmakers trained, taught, and selected the most suitable king or queen from the generation, electing the remaining siblings to positions as military leaders or high nobles. This was done to put all the specialized training the Tarim underwent to good use, even if they did not become a monarch of Iridéa. They kept order and wars of succession to a minimum, one of the things Imbrahil I wanted to eliminate entirely from his new kingdom. After all, he was the product of a war of succession, being the last of his siblings alive to rule Iridéa and form the Aoran Pact with the Silver Sword Coast. It was a habit of the dwarves to dig too deep. The exact depth at which one risks waking or disturbing a great monster or evil is unknown and fluctuates from location to location. However, Vitelian dwarves needed more metals, more gems. They sent many new expeditions into the Earth's heart, discovering untold and vast riches, both mundane and magical. They found ancient life-giving monoliths and titans, giants and gods entombed in the stone and the earth of Saga. They also found the sleeping fava worms. Worms are different from dragons in the way that they are magical beasts, dragons warped by the Arcanum in new and twisted forms. Each worm is unique, and they are the progeny of the fava worms, gods of the ancient world in all but name. They are each terrifying in nature and powerful in both raw strength and magic. Each teeling hold unearthed one of 20 fava worms, where the hungry beasts rampage through each and every settlement. Hundreds of thousands were slain in weeks, and in 2 months of the event known as the Worm Waking, the monsters had reproduced and had born an army of worms, each one vile in purpose and power. Many notable fava worms and worms which would do war against Vitelian holds include Ufrain of the Eternal Flame, Cava Rust of the Frozen Heart, Torteal of the Undying Blight, and the worm known only as Glass Forger, for his scorching fire smelt the sandy brooks of the Teal Mountains into shards of glass. He would later be responsible for the making of the Aelowin Lake March, or the Glass Lakes in the Finori tongue. The great armies of Teal felled 5 fava worms and thousands of lesser worms, each great beast taking down 200 dwarves with it. Soon the last king of Iridéa, Oedin the Ruinous, would gather his troops in Finor and northeast Durnia. He would not send aid to Teal, which would break the eternal friendship of man and dwarf, with many of the mountain folk thinking men to have abandoned them in their greatest time of need. The worm armies even took command of many local beasts and a handful of dragon packs, bringing their numbers to include naturally evolved creatures also. 799, the last year of the 8th century stone giant reckoning, the first platoon of worms came from the mountains, led by the great fava worm of death, Torteal of the Undying Blight. The creature's black brambles grew wherever it scoured the land, bringing with it an unearthly fog to a region they visited and an eternal famine. Soon thunderous birds of prey and the great flying caracot of the ice spires answered the call of Ufrain of the eternal flame, whose wills were bended and broken into fealty by the father worm himself. It should be noted that while the father worms seem intelligent and capable of strategy now, in the coming centuries time would erode their wits and consciousness, until the father worms left alive were reduced to unthinking, animalistic husks of their former selves, much like the worms and beasts they once controlled. Anyways, the father worm Tortil had entered Fëanor, walking with thick, black-scaled legs and with hollowed eyes. With her came a hailstorm of death itself. The Gilbelow hill folk, who survived the great army, were met with great famine and a sickening plague upon their land. Odin brought his wrath upon Tortil in 800 SR at the yawning dawn of the new century. In the battle now called the March of Blight, the steel-clad armies of Iridéa came hurtling upon Tortil. Her army saw the great force, outfitted in steel chainmail and the finest weaponry and armour the kingdom could offer. A culling came as the 7,000-strong army tore through the bestial platoons of the undying Blight. At last the father worm itself emerged. With claw and poison it broke the Iridean line, forever blighting those who survived the frontal line of the march with a terrible ailment or plague of black fervour. However, Odin's eldest son, Lentir, who the kingmakers were planning to be king, hurled his legendary spear imbued with old magic into the heart of the wounded Tortil, slaying it. The March of Blight would carry on for many months later, until 801 SR, as dragon thralls and worms would continue to pour down from the mountains. Meanwhile, the remaining 16 father worms came from the Teal Mountains, instead now making their battle at the Ralanar Fields, which would come to be known as the Firefront Plain. Ufrain and its infernal molten progeny set the Ralanar Fields alight, slaughtering old horse riders of the fields. Only a handful of Ralanar folk escaped the burning of Ralanar, as it was called in later years. That's a lot of saying Ralanar, I heavily apologise. Behind Ufrain walked the last 15 father worms of Telor, who now marched down to kill Iridéa, the great kingdom of man. In this battle, all sons of Odin and Odin himself were present, as their martial skills were unmatched across all families of standing in Iridéa, who also sent many great commanders and generals. The remaining 7,000 troops, who were not plagued and survived the March of the Blight, stood against impossible odds. On Odin's shoulders sat the fate of all Iridéa. He would fail. First, Ufrain the father worm led his forces to round the lines of archers and siege weapons used to batter down the previous father worm excursions. It killed a few squads itself before vanishing behind the line, being hit in the side with a stray boulder or ballista bolt, as some say. Its worms and beast thralls would do its work. Soon the glass forger was grappling on the eastern line against hook and thrown chain, pinning the creature down, where a horde of swordsmen and axemen swarmed and took out the worm's eyes, causing glass forger to retreat from the battle all the way to the western borderlands. Meanwhile, the arrows of Imbrahil's forces in the south peppered the battlefield, killing many more worms. Standing with Ufrain was 2 nameless father worms of the mountain stone as a new excursion came, whose echoing roars shattered the eardrums of man and beasts alike. The 2 shattered many trebuchets. Before Odin's youngest put an end to the worm with the help of his older brother, taking out the worm's eyes and spilling their throat. Soon claw, hoof, tooth, shield and axe met in this nook of hills here as the fava worms closed in on the remaining troops of Iridéa, some say led by Odin himself, and some say an ambush came. And thus the stage was set for the climax of the greatest battle in Iridean history. Riders of horses and Tarakur from the Ride of the Sun Lords came from the woodlands east and west, coming upon Cavarost of the Frozen Heart, hidden in the rocky groves and thickets there. A month and a half earlier they had been called upon, as in ages past, to aid in the coming war against the worms. They always had, did, and will keep their oath to Iridéa, even when fallen, so to maintain their status as a sovereign people. They crashed into the lines of Cavarost of the Frozen Heart, slaying 2,000 of its children. Angered beyond mortal belief or comprehension, Cavarost tossed and devoured horse and Tarakirman as if they were limp, discarded tendons and sinew from an unfinished meal. The Western Sun Lords, too, broke the lines of Ufrain. However, the cowardly fava worm fled to survive to the modern day in the last dwarven hold Sterak. The tide turned, only to see the arrival of 6 more fava worms, including the worm still spoken of with fear 120 years later. This worm is known as Kelmor, the closest thing Telor ever got to a Dark Lord. Thousands died at the new worm's hands. Odin called his men to fight against the falling of their kingdom, of their ancestral home. Yet it was for naught, as Kelmor would be greatly wounded in his now legendary duel with Odin, which is why they called him the Ruinous. Not only for he was the last king of Iridéa, but because he shattered Kelmor through unknown, likely cosmically magical means, splintering the fava worm across all time and space. This spell would also splinter him, sending him hurtling through the unending abyss of Saga itself. That chapter of Iridéa's fall is unknown to historians. All assume Odin simply fell killing Kelmor. However, these scholars did find it odd their bodies were never found. In the years after 801 SR, without a king, queen, or military to keep Iridéa together, the kingdom of man, last great power of Telor, fell. The baronies of Prath, Dorinia, and Fëanor would later consolidate into their own royal families and armies, starting their own wars, histories, tales, tragedies, joys, and conquests. Metelian dwarves would never recover, and their northern cousins of Kefir, called Dara Mor by the Manish Tuns, would later fall to the last remaining worm armies, leaving only a handful of dwarven holds left, with Sterak as the last true powerful hold. Iridéa was the last great kingdom of man or dwarf in Telor, and a new age began when this great kingdom fell. Well, so I hope that you enjoyed that. I know that it's been around, I'm pretty sure like 21 days since the last video. That's because I was working on this one, and I was also going on a bunch of hikes, which is lovely. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about that last battle sequence. I thought it was pretty bad. Yeah, I tried my best again. I'm not really working with those advanced tools here, but I really wanted to include a battle scene inspired by Clanka, another world building channel. They do a lot of fantastic like battle videos of their world, Old Exilium, which is, and I got a little bit jealous. I'm not gonna lie, I got a little bit jealous, so I tried to do that. Mainly everything in this video will probably stay the same. I won't be retconned anytime soon. Now, in like a few years, I probably will, if I'm even still working on Telor in a few years. But I think that's it for meta stuff, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I don't like asking people to like, subscribe, comment at the end of the video, because I'm assuming that you're not brain dead and that you know what to do when you like content, even though that would probably boost a lot of stuff for me. But again, just like asking someone to like, even like especially at the start of the video, that's just, come on, like they know what to do if they enjoy a video. Anyways, I'm ranting. I apologize. Thank you. That'll be all.